Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our event today, God, Migration, and the Climate Crisis, a faith climate panel. My name is Andrew Steele, and I serve as the Vice President for Development and Outreach at Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. I want to thank all of you for joining us today who will be watching this from your homes, your offices, in many cases, your home offices, and for your time and interest in this critical topic. Now, before we get started today, I just want to cover a few housekeeping items. This session will be recorded and circulated after the event, so we encourage you to share it to your colleagues, family members, congregations, and friends. We're also live streaming on Facebook as we speak, so feel free to share the event so others can watch it as well. There will be a question and answer session towards the end of the hour. Please, at any point, feel free to submit your questions on our Zoom Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. And for those watching on Facebook, simply comment your question. And a final note, this will be one of LIRS's many discussions about climate migration and the impacts of climate change on immigrants and refugees. I hope you'll continue to engage with us, and you can do so through our social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, at the handle @LIRS.org, as well as through our website, lirs.org. Again, thank you for being with us. And with all of that covered now, I'd like to start the event with a word of prayer. So let us pray. God of life, give us the strength we need to proclaim justice and mercy for all people. Give us love and a spirit of selflessness to be your voice, to speak your word, and to be true advocates of justice, knowing that you are with us always. Accompany your people, O God. Lead us into active ways of love for your neighbors who have no place to call home or to lay their heads this night. Clothe us in the armor of light to serve and tend the needs of refugees, especially those fleeing climate change disasters. And strengthen us that we may be a balm in this wounded world. Amen. I'd now like to turn the conversation over to LIRS President and CEO and moderator for today's panel, Krish Vignarajah.
Good afternoon. As noted, my name is Krish Vignarajah, and I'm the President and CEO of Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. We're so glad you are all able to join us today for this important discussion. As some of you know, LIRS is the largest faith-based U.S. nonprofit dedicated to refugees and immigrants. While we as an organization have always recognized the importance and immediate danger of the climate crisis, we are now heightening our focus on ways in which the climate crisis influences human displacement and migration. You may have joined us for our event on September 23rd as part of the UN Climate Week, when we discussed how the climate crisis is affecting people across the world and what we can do in the immigration and refugee space to begin to address it. Because we can't ignore the facts. Today, 2/3 of all migration is caused by the climate crisis. Drought, wildfires, crop failures, and rising sea levels are driving people from their homes and away from their livelihoods, friends, and family. Often they're forced to relocate to unsafe areas where they face discrimination, violence, and poor living conditions. This is happening even here in the United States. You only have to look to California to see the effects climate change is having within our own borders. We feel we have a responsibility to help. LIRS has been providing assistance to displaced people from around the world for 80 years, and we believe that the US can and should lead the way in creating pathways to citizenship for climate refugees. We know that migration is a last resort. There are many policy changes we need to explore and adaptive measures we need to take so that people do not have to leave their homes and communities. But we also know many do not have a choice. Whether forced to move by war or drought, by persecution, or by loss of land due to rising sea levels, displaced people deserve dignity, respect, and the ability to start over. That means our conversations about climate change solutions need to be accompanied by conversations about climate migration. As we'll hear from our esteemed panelists today, climate change is an immediate, ever worsening threat to vulnerable populations around the world. LIRS is working behind the scenes to propose policies that recognize the effects of climate displacement and to create legal pathways for climate migration. We hope you'll join us in advocating and spreading the message. But today, we'll be looking at the climate crisis through the lens of faith and asking big questions about God, humanity, and our responsibility to the world we live in. I hope you'll find the discussion enriching, and by the end of today's panel, I hope you'll feel empowered to share what we've discussed with your respective communities, faith-based and otherwise, and work to support those affected by climate migration. I encourage you to ask questions in the Q&A box and to get in touch after the panel with questions, comments, or ideas. The climate crisis is a challenge we all face as one human family, and we must work together to find solutions and protect the most vulnerable. Again, thank you so much for joining us. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panelists. Bill McKibben is an American environmentalist, author, and journalist who has written extensively on the impact of global warming. He is the Schumann Distinguished Scholar at Middlebury College and the founder and senior advisor emeritus of the climate campaign group 350.org. His 1989 book, The End of Nature, is regarded as the first book for a general audience about climate change and has appeared in 24 languages. His work appears regularly in periodicals from The New Yorker to Rolling Stone. Bill has won the Gandhi Peace Prize as well as honorary degrees from 19 colleges and universities. He was awarded the Right Livelihood Award, sometimes called the Alternative Nobel, in the Swedish Parliament. Foreign Policy named him to its inaugural list of the world's 100 most important global thinkers. Cynthia Moe-Lobeda has lectured or consulted throughout the world in theology, ethics, and matters of climate justice and climate racism, moral agency, globalization, economic justice, public church, ecofeminist theology, and faith-based resistance to systemic oppression. Her most recent book, Resisting Structural Evil, Love as Ecological Economic Vocation, won a Nautilus Award for Social Justice. A prolific writer, Dr. Moe-Lobeda was awarded Theological Consultant to the presiding bishop of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and has served as a health worker and church worker in Honduras and is director of the Washington, D.C. office of Augsburg College's Center for Global Education. She is a co-founder of Seattle University's Center for Environmental Justice and Sustainability and of the new Center for Climate Justice and Faith at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary. Moe-Lobeda is professor of theological and social ethics at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary, Church Divinity School of the Pacific, and Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. She holds a doctoral degree in Christian ethics from Union Theological Seminary, affiliated with Columbia University. Pastor Tommy Richter served his first call for almost 3 years in Shishmaref, Alaska, the northernmost Lutheran church in the ELCA. Shishmaref is an island 10 miles south of the Arctic Circle off the coast of mainland Alaska in the Bering Sea. It is an Alaskan native village of subsistence hunter-gatherers who are on the front lines of climate change and battle its drastic effects firsthand. Pastor Tommy moved from winter to winter and has since served a congregation in the Twin Cities and is now in his third call at Zion Lutheran Church of Manistee in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Pastor Tommy is a philosopher, poet, and avid walking enthusiast. He owes his call to ministry to Lutheran outdoor camping and has always had the environment and nature in places close to his heart. Thank you all for being with us today. So global displacement is at record high today, And while the need to migrate due to political instability, persecution, and economic reasons has always been present, we're seeing more climate migration due to extreme weather events, and this trend is getting worse every day. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, an average of 22.5 million people was displaced by climate or weather-related events between 2000 and 2018, and the numbers keep rising. The International Organization for Migration estimates that by 2050, there will be 200 million climate displaced persons, and yet it seems not enough is being done to address this growing crisis. So, Bill, I'd like to start with you to frame the scope of the problem. What are some of the humanitarian impacts of climate change that you have seen? And how has the issue of climate displacement evolved in the last decade?
Well, Krish, many thanks for that kind introduction and good question. What a pleasure to get to join you and Pastor Tommy and Cynthia, old friend. It's kind of you to have a mere Methodist on board with you for the day. I appreciate it. And I confess in this august company that I've never risen any higher in the Methodist hierarchy than Sunday school teacher. So take my words for what they're worth. Look, this topic couldn't be more important, not just because climate change is the biggest thing that's ever happened on the planet, and by some orders of magnitude, at least in the course of human history, but also because the iron law of global warming is the less you did to cause it, the quicker and the harder you get hit by it. There's never been an issue of justice that rises to the level, the magnitude that this will over the course of this century. So just to give you the briefest background, we're in the early stages of climate change. Because we've burned huge quantities of coal and gas and oil and changed the chemistry of the atmosphere, we've so far raised the temperature of the Earth about 1 degree Celsius, 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. That doesn't sound like so much, but the heat that we trap each day is the equivalent of about 400,000 Hiroshima-sized explosions. So that's the heat that was enough to melt more than a half of the summer sea ice in the Arctic, which is why Shishmaref suddenly found itself with waves, where there used to be calm or frozen ocean. It's been enough to raise the level of the seas already considerably to kill off perhaps half the coral in the world, on which 500 million people depend for sustenance, to cause great desertification and forest fire and drought, and to complement that with enormous flooding. The really scary part of this, Krish, is that 1 degree is but the on-ramp to this catastrophe. Even if we do everything right at this point, it's going to be hard to stop much short of 2 degrees Celsius. And the trajectory we're on at the moment is for a rise in temperature of 3.5 or 4 degrees Celsius. Anything like those numbers will preclude us from having civilizations anything like the ones we're used to having. So let me say, job one of any discussion about climate change is to keep it from getting any worse than it has to get. That's the work that so many of us spend our lives on, trying to somehow bring the fossil fuel industry to bay and put in place sensible policies that replace dirty energy with clean and somehow limit that rise in temperature to something that might allow civilizations to survive. But even if we do that at this point, we already have enormous problems with dislocated people around the world. From the beginning of human civilization, humans have spread out further and further and further into farther corners of the planet, almost as described in the first chapter of Genesis. And that now is contracting. The size of the board on which we play the human game is shrinking. It's shrinking at the edges of the continents, where it's becoming much harder to cope with sea level rise, and already we're seeing people abandon communities. It's shrinking in the interior of continents, where drought and heat wave are making things impossible. It's shrinking along the wild, forest interface, where fire now drives people from their homes in great numbers. It's shrinking because there are places where the rapid spread of mosquito-borne disease, things like dengue fever, are making life impossible. So the number of people displaced by climate change is going to continue to grow exponentially. The high estimate of the UN High Commission on Refugees is that we might see 1 billion such people before the century is out. And the thing to just bear in mind, especially from a moral standpoint as we think about this, is that almost all of these people were not the people who caused the problem from which they are suffering. We think that the top 1% of the population produces as much greenhouse gases as the bottom 50% of the population. The top 10%, and that includes virtually everybody likely to be listening to this podcast, produces most of the world's carbon emissions. So when we talk about the fact that we're heating the planet, the we is somewhat smaller than we sometimes think, and the obligation on that we to do something about it is pretty enormous.
Bill, thank you for that honest assessment, but also for drawing the connection between, the economic inequality and frankly, the climate inequality that will be experienced. Pastor Tommy, I want to try to bring this local. So I actually watched the CNN special on Shishmaref, and it was heartbreaking to see how, these families will likely become climate refugees. Can you tell us what you've observed from your experience living and ministering in Alaska? How did the effects of the climate crisis manifest in the daily lives of the people in your community? And how did it affect the ministry that you provided?
Thank you. Yeah, I always say that the best way to describe Shishmaref, for those that don't know, is with the word off. It's off the road system, it's off the grid, it's off the coast of mainland Alaska, it's off in the middle of nowhere, and it's off as in past its expiration date, which is my kind of morbid humor about the situation. But the people of Shishmaref are on the front lines of climate crisis. The realities of our warming planet are writ large in the very real everyday suffering of the people on that island. They don't have the luxury of asking the question if climate change is real, because there's no way to avoid how different things are up there. Ice that used to be miles thick is now feet thick, if it's there at all. And Shishmaref depends on that ice to protect it from sea storms and erosion, and it's also a crucial access route to food sources. And the permafrost and sand that used to be the firm foundation that the village is built on is melting away. And the island is shrinking and sinking. So homes are tumbling into the sea. The island loses about 7 feet of ground to erosion per year. And many families have lost primary food providers and family members through that thin ice. So the season for seal hunting, which is their primary staple for subsistence hunter-gatherer society, is shorter and more dangerous in every passing year. And some families have stopped participating in the hunt altogether, choosing to have less food and provisions for the long winter and more hunters that are still alive. And so that's not a choice that they should have to make. The community has twice voted to move, and they've even identified a site 17 miles away on the mainland for development of a new village. But there is no mobility, no funding, and no government support that can empower them to make that move a reality. There's no current support structure or programs for preventative moving of a village. There's support for crisis, and so basically they're stuck waiting until they're forced to see the death of their village. So the answer to the second part of your question, what was ministry like up there, is the ministry I provided there was primarily a ministry of accompaniment through trauma. I spent 99% of my time in pastoral care, listening to people's stories, tending to woundedness, battling depression, and holding space for people to grieve the loss of their livelihood and the loss of their loved ones. So.
Thank you, Pastor Tommy. And to be able to hear how, there's a lack of support for Americans, right, who are dealing with these crisis conditions until a disaster actually comes about is really heart-wrenching. So thank you for your ministry to them in these very difficult times. I'd like to turn now to some of the ethical and theological dimensions of climate migration. According to many traditions, people of faith are not only required to preserve God's creation, but directed to restore it. At LIRS, we envision a world in which all people are assured a secure and meaningful life that is ecologically responsible and sustainable, and in which every form of life has intrinsic value. So our goal is to embody both hope and moral agency when addressing the crisis of climate displacement, in addition to its social and ecological consequences. So within that frame, I'd like to turn to you first, Cynthia. You've written that religion and faith may offer the moral and spiritual framework for the fundamental reorientation of life that is required if humans are to live sustainably within Earth's ecological systems. Can you expand on that? What does this reorientation of life look like?
Krish, that's such a marvelous and enormous question. It draws us right to the heart of Christian faith. Christians in the earliest decades insisted that following Jesus meant a dramatic reorientation of life. The word repentance in the New Testament means to think and perceive the world and act differently, to have a new consciousness, new actions. And that is equally true for us today. God calls us yet again to turn away from the dominant orienting story of who we are and what this earth is and what gives us worth and what freedom is from and for and what our rights are. What we assume in response to those questions shapes how we live. It is not so much what we think, but what we are unconsciously socialized to assume. We, at least most of us in the US, have been formed to live in ways that are destroying the climate conditions required for life on Earth to flourish. We are forging ahead as players in an orienting story that is destroying the homes and livelihoods of 22 million climate migrants, soon to be hundreds of millions, the people of Shishmara. We don't intend to do this. The 10% of us that Bill mentioned, we don't intend to do this, but we have been oriented into unconscious assumptions about who we are and how we ought live that have this terrible consequence. For example, we have been formed to assume that humans are a special species that has the right and the freedom to use the earth to meet our desires and maximize profit. Producing and consuming fossil fuels, plastics, chemicals, meat and other industrialized food and more in ways that maximize our comfort, maximize economic growth, and maximize profit, including our investment profits, is our human right, according to the dominant orienting story. That is not God's orientation to who the human creature is and what freedom is, according to the biblical witness. Moreover, many Christians have been formed to believe that what surrounds us, the earth and its creatures and elements, is a great stage in which the truly significant epic drama, the God-human drama, takes place. That is not God's orientation to what the earth is, according to the biblical witness. Faith begs us to reorient, and it offers us the reorientation. The Great Spirit beckons us to re-see ourselves as earthlings. Adam in Genesis is made by God from Adamah, the earth. And we are animated by the very same breath, the God breath, that animates or inspirits other creatures. Just think about it. The world of mammals includes Jesus. Jesus was a mammal. And this good garden earth was very, very good, declares its creator, intrinsically good before humans appear on the scene. In fact, the earth was not just the stage, but rather it was a player, even a co-creator with God, according to Genesis. The winds and waters and mountains do the most sacred things in the Bible. They praise God, testify to God's goodness, and even bear witness. According to Luther and many others, the elements and creatures of earth are God's body. All things, Luther said, are indeed full of God, even the tiniest leaf. Here's another reorientation example. We are oriented to assume that advanced global capitalism is inevitable, even divinely ordained. But that is not true. It is not inevitable. It is a humanly constructed system, and any humanly constructed system can be deconstructed and rebuilt otherwise. More important, this form of economy certainly is not compatible with God's ways and wills as seen in the life of Jesus or the scriptures before him. The biblical witness is not to maximize profit or consumption, regardless of the cost to earth and its people. To the contrary, the Bible as a whole suggests that economic life is to be oriented around 1, serving Earth's well-being, 2, meeting human needs, not human desires to accumulate, and 3, protecting the vulnerable. God speaks harshly of economic practices in which some accumulate wealth and others are exploited. Economic practices such as a profit-maximizing fossil fuel industry. So Krish, yes, trusting in this God indeed offers life-saving spiritual and material reorientation toward a world in which neither our neighbors around the globe nor ourselves will be forced from our homes by climate disaster.
Thank you, Cynthia. That was incredibly powerful. And I want to pick up on your comment about a humanly constructed system and direct this question to Tommy. So what are some of the ways that you have seen the local community work, not in terms of exploitation, but the local community work to protect the rights of people that have been displaced? And how do you see nonprofits, businesses even, faith-based entities coming together to address the humanitarian toll of climate change and displacement?
I think some of the best and most important work is some of that reframing that Cynthia was talking about. The best way to protect the rights of people displaced and disparaged by climate disaster is to reframe and notice that all other ground is Shishmaref ground. There's no such thing as the people living way over there off the edge of the world experiencing a climate crisis, and then us over here comfortable in our backyards. That's a false duality. We might not depend on the ice for shelter from storms and for our access to our food. We might not be able to see our own relatives and homes fall through melting ice up close and personal. But the crisis in Shishmaref is still very much our crisis. Shishmaref is not the only ground sinking into the ocean. Our whole planet is changing. And whether you live right in the mess and the thaw of it or not, your ground is also Shishmaref ground. Your ground is as much sinking and shrinking as Shishmaref is. So local community works to protect the rights of people being displaced by climate when they take ownership of themselves, of that displacement. Nonprofits and faith-based entities can help address this by telling those stories, by amplifying the voices of those who are living on the front lines, and by teaching our congregations and our constituents that there is no us and them. We have only the one planet on which to live, and all of us are in this together. When Shishmaref sinks, so do we.
Mm.
Thank you, Pastor Tommy, for that perspective, which I do think, suggests the unity of this cause, and the dire need for collective action. So, I want to turn to the next question. In the 4th century, Saint Ambrose wrote, "For the mystery of the incarnation of God is the salvation of the whole of creation." The Christian tradition particularly sees the health and well-being of all creation as an essential tenet of salvation. So much of what we've discussed today stresses the importance of embracing interconnectedness, Pastor Tommy's, as you've just described, particularly the connection between God, human beings, and the earth, as Cynthia also described. Respect for that interconnectedness then demands radical change in society's collective actions. Bill, you suggest in your book by the same title that we have experienced the end of nature because the impact of human beings is inescapable. Obviously, you made those comments, in the response to the first question. As a person of faith, how does that sense of human responsibility impact your study of the environment and your own environmental advocacy? And how does your faith impact your understanding of climate displacement and the moral imperative to take action?
Well, I told you that I was just a Sunday school teacher, so don't expect too much here, but it does seem to me obvious that the very first thing we're told to do in the good book is take care of the world around us. We watch in some awe as God creates all the things that fly around and creep around and crawl around and wander around. And then he says, your job's to take care of them. A job, it must be said, we're manifestly failing at, since chances are at current trends will wipe out about half of them before the century is over. There's already something like 60% fewer animals on this planet than there were in 1970. So that gives you some sense of how good we're doing. And then, if you wanted to, if you had to pick one sentence to sum up the New Testament, it might well be, love your God and love your neighbor. We're doing, again, a poor job of this. We're figuring out lots of ways to drown our neighbors, sicken them, make it impossible for them to grow food, on and on and on. And none of this seems to me, none of this seems very complex to me. I take heart in my theological ignorance from reading the Pope and seeing that he's reaching the same set of conclusions. I think that Laudato Si and last week's Fratelli Tutti, brothers all, his 2 encyclicals on the topic are 2 of the best critiques of modernity yet produced in this century, and truly important documents. They don't, they're only one lens at which to come through this. You could reach all the same conclusions about what we could and should do if you didn't have a theological bone in your body and were simply interested in the sort of preservation of the species and yourself. Pure reason leads you in the same direction. I think the place where faith may come in handy is that it allows us to hope that if we do absolutely everything we can, then there's still some hope that the world may meet us halfway. And I tell you, that's becoming a harder hope to sustain for scientists with each year that passes and each event we see. So that's not hope against hope, and it's not like faith is a get out of jail free card. It's a requirement to do absolutely everything that we can, but it does allow us at least to do it perhaps in a slightly different spirit. It certainly increases the pressure on us to take account not only of the of the very immediate causes of the damage, but also of all the people who are suffering that damage. And that's why talking about refugees, which could not be a more gospel thing to do, it is so important. Look, since I'm I'm just blunt. First thing I'll say is, job one here obviously is to no longer have an administration that tells refugees to go away, which is what the current one does. And job two is then to figure out, and it's not going to be easy, how we plan for a huge increase in the number of those refugees, because people, through no fault of their own, the numbers are already startling. When the Times analyzed the people flowing up from Guatemala and Nicaragua and Central America to the southern border, they concluded that the majority of them were coming because the drought in the highlands of those countries had made agriculture essentially impossible. Mm-hmm. That drought's not because of anything anybody in Guatemala did. That's what we did. The 4% of us who live here have poured more carbon into the atmosphere than any nation in the world.
And I'm going to pick up on your comment about faith and direct this to Cynthia. So Cynthia, from your perspective, which resources in the Christian tradition can help make that radical transition to a sustainable Earth-human relationship? And how can our actions toward social justice include environmental justice?
Well, Christian traditions, meaning scripture and theology and liturgy and spirituality and other practices, really do offer a treasure trove of resources for the transition to a sustainable relationship with our planetary home. And Pastor Tommy and Bill have both mentioned significant resources. I would suggest that another is what Ambrose claimed that you read a few minutes ago, Krish, and that has been claimed by many voices throughout Christian history, and that is the firm conviction that all of creation is being saved by God. The idea that salvation includes only humans is not the consensus of the church throughout time. Now, if God is bringing all of creation to abundant life for all, and if the church is called, as Lutheranism affirms, and Methodism too, Bill, to participate with God in God's work, then surely we are to serve Earth's well-being, not its devastation. A second resource, and related to that, is the faith claim, again, heard throughout the ages in the church, but not all parts of the church, that God lives within the created world as well as beyond it. Luther says it so beautifully. He insists, Christ, I'm quoting, Christ is present in all creatures, and I might find Christ in stone, in fire, in water, for he is certainly there, end quote. If Christ lives in this earth, then are we crucifying Christ in our brutal impact on the earth? I think Christian traditions offer so many resources. It's very hard for me to talk in 5 or 7 minutes about this question, but one other one is the one that Bill mentioned a moment ago, and that is this mind-boggling, world-shifting ethic and spirituality of neighbor love. You will love your neighbor as yourself, says Jesus, quoting the Hebrew scriptures. And mind you, we get this as followers of a dark-skinned Palestinian Jew named Jesus. We get this from the Hebrew tradition, the Jewish tradition. We are called into existence to receive and trust the love of God and then to embody it in the world. And as I learned from New Testament scholar Matthew Whitlock, when Jesus says you will love your neighbor as yourself, it is not just a commandment, it is a promise. The verb agapao is in the future indicative. Jesus is saying that we will love neighbor as self. That is part of the awesome mystery of this ethic. But equally transformative is what neighbor love means. We have so terribly domesticated and privatized this wild idea. Dr. Martin Luther King noted, as he noted, love as a biblical norm is not an affectionate or compassionate or good feeling toward people. It is an active commitment to their well-being. And where the neighbor is damaged by injustice, and this would include climate change and white supremacy, neighbor love includes seeking to dismantle the injustice. That is why in the Lutheran Church, we claim that in baptism, God makes a covenant with us that we will seek justice and peace in all the earth. Just dwell on that one. God covenanted with you that you will love neighbor as self with a love that seeks to dismantle unjust systems and replace them with more equitable and earth-honoring ways of living. That is a covenant God made with you. Go figure. This calling and promise are inherent in our very being, our bones, our blood. It's part of who we are. Today, I think it means that we will engage heart and soul in what Bill mentioned a minute ago, preventing climate change from being as bad as it could be, keeping it to the minimum damage and destruction. But I need to note another resource in Christian traditions, and that is the resurrection promise, that out of death and destruction, be it personal or societal or ecological, God will raise up life. So says the resurrection. This promise can fill our beings in the midst of warranted despair. Regardless of whatever happens in the climate catastrophe, we know that God will bring life. That does not mean we sit back and pretend that God will stop climate change. Oh no, God uses human beings to do God's work. We, empowered by the Spirit of God, the life-changing power of the cosmos, we are called by that Spirit to throw ourselves into neighbor love that builds climate-friendly and socially just, that is racially and economically equitable, ways of living in God's good garden earth. Social justice and environmental matters such as climate are inseparably linked. And we see that in the statement that those who are not causing it are suffering most. And those who are not causing it are disproportionately people of color around the world and economically poor people. My best guideline is to approach all matters of environment or ecology or energy policy or climate policy with a racial justice lens and an economic justice lens. That means asking, how does this action or policy or plan impact Black and Brown and Indigenous people in this country and around the globe? How does it impact economically impoverished people in the long term and the short term? So that is just to say that an ethic and spirituality of neighbor love empowers and calls us to be seeking climate justice. That would include, going back to Tommy's comment, Pastor Tommy's comments about Shishmaref, seeking just ways, reparations, we could call it, such that people in Shishmaref and other people forced into climate migration receive equitable and life-giving ways of meeting their needs. And let me just say that ethic of neighbor love, while Christians know it in the words of Jesus, comes into the world through the ancient Hebrew tradition. The Muslim traditions, the Jewish traditions, the Christian traditions all hold the ethic of neighbor love. And I would argue that all of Earth's great faith traditions hold a similar ethic and spirituality, but use different words. Buddhism uses the word compassion. So Krish, thank you for that very, very question. And thank you also, Bill and Pastor Tommy, for what you have already added in response to it.
Wonderful. And thank you, Cynthia, for your comments in terms of we can't just sit back and watch. And so this is my last question before I open it up to audience questions. I know we have several, so I'm going to request that you try to respond in as pithy a fashion as you can. I'd like to leave our audience with a concrete action that they can take to move us closer to that symbiotic relationship between humanity and the earth, particularly in regards to climate displacement. So could each of you name one or two ways that people of faith can act on behalf of climate displaced people? How can we broaden support for this issue? Tommy, if you could start us off.
So I think there's one thing that's essential and practical that you can do, and that's to not let stories of suffering and realities of the climate crisis end in a place of shame. Just like the Gospels do not end with death on a cross, neither should these stories end with your shame. Shame is a destructive force and is as dangerous and as life-threatening as the rising sea level and the melting of the ice. It's not how truths should move us. Or in my Lutheran terms, I would say, this is not a good end to preaching the law. If when you're talking about the truth of the human condition and the climate crisis, you end with despair and shame, then you are not done talking about it. If you hear that your ground is sinking and that the end of that is you coiling up in shame and sinking with it, then things are worse. They're not better. So tell the stories, but then also tell how truth should move us. And that is to hope, to real hope, not false hope, and to a way forward in faith, to recognizing ourselves and our neighbors, as she was talking about earlier, and take comfort in the fact that we are not alone in this, that we are loved, forgiven, and sent back out into the world in that same spirit, to love and to forgive others. And that includes a call to love and forgive our planet.
Great. And Bill, can I ask you to respond next?
Sure. There's always a dynamic tension in dealing with climate change between actions that we take as individuals or even communities and actions that we take on a larger scale. It's really important, to make sure that your house or your church has solar panels and that your community is welcoming a refugee family and building a Habitat for Humanity house to put them in and so on and so forth. That's incredibly important. But climate change is a mathematical problem in many ways, and the math is very daunting and very large, and it can't be solved at this point, one Tesla at a time, one vegan meal at a time. The flood of refugees is large enough that it isn't going to be solved, one congregation at a time. It's going to be solved by changing economic and political structures which is entirely possible to do. Young people around this country, for instance, are demanding what they call a Green New Deal, which would be a very different way of treating people and the planet going forward. And when we think about it in international terms, those are the terms we need to think about it in. It would be a very good idea, for instance, not to repudiate and get rid of leaders who remove their countries from the only international effort, the Paris Climate Accords, to do anything about climate change. It might be a good idea to look twice at leaders who refer to other countries around the world in vulgar terms that you would be ashamed to use in church or anywhere else, really. The time has come for some kind of new ethic of solidarity, but that has to be expressed in real terms, and that will only happen to the degree that individuals become somewhat less individual and join together with others in movements large enough to force quick and profound change. Since it's an even-numbered year in the autumn, those of us in the United States have great leverage in one realm of that in the next couple of weeks. But November 4th is as much a day for politics as November 3rd, and Wall Street's as important to go after as Washington. There's a lot of work to be done, a lot of people doing it. Get together with them, because you're going to be much stronger if you do.
Cynthia, can I get a quick reply from you?
You bet. First, I iterate what Bill and Pastor Tommy said. In addition, I think I would just say we can see ourselves within a great cloud of witnesses led by God's Spirit to seek abundant life for all. Trust yourself to be a player in that story in 3 arenas. First is behavioral or lifestyle. That is the arena where we decide to reduce our own carbon footprints in our households. But at this point in history, as Bill just noted, the second arena is even more crucial, and I can't say this strongly enough. It's the arena of social structural change, change in economic and political structures. Be involved in an organization that aims to change the rules of the game, that is public policy, or the flow of money, that is divestment and reinvestment. Life on Earth depends now on humans acting in that arena of social structural change. One such organization is 350.org with Bill. Another is ELCA's advocacy offices. Another is LIRS's advocacy work. And the third arena is worldview or consciousness. You got at this, Krish, with your first opening question about reorienting. Human creatures are beckoned to reboot our understanding of who we are and what this world is. I'm working on that personally. For example, when I pass a tree, I see a dwelling place of God. When I sing the liturgy, I imagine all the creation singing and wailing in lament. When I hear the peeping birds and the squeaking insects, I listen for God's voice. And when I see myself, I try to see not an I, but a we, like 1 trillion organisms living in my body, a body that couldn't breathe without trees out there. Climate migrants, intimately a part of me, not me as separate. And consciousness change also includes what we allow ourselves to see. And I really advocate what I call critical mystical vision, that is seeing 3 things at once. One is the reality of what's going on, what we heard from Bill and Tommy at the very beginning. Second is the immense world of possibilities, of more just and ecological possibilities in the making now. And third is seeing the power and presence of the sacred luring us from the way things are towards the way things could be. So yes, see yourself as a player in God's story of life and play in all 3 of those arenas: behavioral change, social structural change, and consciousness change. And then give thanks that we, the people alive now, have been called into life at this time in history when what we do matters. This 5 years in history, when what we do matters, give thanks that we're called into being at this time. Those are my thoughts.
Right. I know we have a number of questions to answer in limited time. So what I'm going to try doing is asking them as pairs. So we have one question from Kevin. Are the effects of climate change more severe in some parts of the world than others? How are any disparate impacts expected to influence the flow of refugees and migrants? And then we have 2 questions that are related. One is from Ben. Does LIRS have a recommendation for the US refugee ceiling? Trump reduced it to 15,000 recently. It was over 200,000 in the previous administration. It was much higher in the 1970s. Does LIRS have a number for the US? And there's one related question from Rachel. My question concerns how climate-focused, faith-based, and refugee service organizations collaborate to defeat the myths of the dangerous refugee and climate hoax promulgated in the US. What was a cap at about 110,000 is now 15,000. How do we ensure people from climate displacement, people refuge from climate displacement if we've literally shut the doors to the science of climate change? So I will quickly insert just the response from LIRS's perspective. We think it is an abomination, un-American truly, and really a disgrace to so many faith communities that feel called to welcome the stranger, that we went from 110,000 just before the start of this administration to now what we expect to be 15,000. We would at least call for the historical average if you take Republican and Democratic administrations before this one, which would give us a number of 95,000. But I will just note that the presidential candidate, Biden, has already declared that he would want to raise the number to 125,000 at a time when we have a historic high of almost 80 million displaced around the world. It does seem like a number at 125,000 would be appropriate. And so that is what we have been advocating for. But welcome comments from the panel. Bill, do you want to take a stab at that?
I'll just say, in numerical terms, it's going to have to end up being higher than that as time goes on. If there's, going to be hundreds of millions of climate refugees, and the U.S. is responsible for 40% of the carbon that broke the back of the climate system. I mean, the math is going to, and the good news is, I think another way of saying this is, it's high time that we stop thinking about refugees, people coming from other places to America as some kind of hideous burden that we have to tolerate. This is over and over again what makes America the wonderful place that it historically has been, is its ability to assimilate all kinds of people with all kinds of beautiful ideas about the world coming from every direction. So, it'll be nice to at least begin getting back to a country that understands what its roots are about, instead of one that's been indulging in just racist nonsense for 4 years.
So two questions that I'm again going to combine from Catherine. How do we speak to our faith communities in ways that reflect the urgency of climate attention? And from Wayne, during COVID, some congregations are offering parking lot worship. Hot and cold days, obviously car engines will be run. Should Christians be concerned with our creation be holding parking lot services? So Pastor Tommy, do you want to take that one, or Cynthia?
Yeah, so as someone who is doing parking lot services as a way to find some sense of gathering that's not just over Zoom, I have personally felt very conflicted about it because I know people are running their engines and it's not helpful. But yeah, I don't have if I had a better way to gather in person during the cold, I would come up with it. But I don't have the current tools to come up with a safer, cleaner way to do that.
Let me step in my role as bishop of the Sunday school of my neck of the woods, and just absolve you of any worry here. This is not on the list of problems to worry about. This is not a big one. That's going to be the best eighth of a gallon of gasoline that people spend but it's a good thing to remind us what we're doing, and a better thing to remind people that if they bring their dog with them to church and park it on their lap during the service, they'll stay warm anyway. So, but this is the perfect example of the kind of thing not to get done up worrying about. The things that cause climate change operate on an entirely different scale.
Yeah, we're talking about government level and big level things that are and so one of the tools of the oppression of climate change is shifting shame to the small people, which is why I ended my comments talking about how shame is not a helpful place to end, because that's where a lot of the corporate conversations go, is like, oh, it's your fault you're not recycling enough, it's your fault you haven't reduced your carbon footprint enough. But really, those are drops in the bucket compared to the corporate misdealings. Yeah.
A way to say this that's really will strike home to people this year is, look, we're coming through this horrible pandemic. People changed their lives more than we've ever changed our lives in any of our lifetimes. Nobody got on an airplane, nobody was commuting. Emissions went down, but they only went down 8 or 9%. So it's a reminder that individual actions count, but that most of the damage we're doing is hardwired into our systems. And so it's those systems that need to change.
So I will only ask 3 final questions. So one question we have is from Myra. What can we do to help the people of Shishmaref move to a safe and economically sustainable place? We also have a question from Mac. We have seen how refugees and immigrants have unfairly stoked fear and the rise of populism and hate in America. Do you foresee the internal displacement of American citizens due to climate change also stoking tension and hate wherever they are forced to resettle? How do we prevent this as it becomes a bigger problem in America? So I'll ask Pastor Tommy and then others to answer. I'll just make one comment from our prior panel where we had a representative from Louisiana speak about how during the hurricane season, there was actually a community, a city in Louisiana that basically said, we cannot take other Louisianans who need to relocate. So I think it's a great question in terms of, I won't call it xenophobia, but this kind of, we need to protect ourselves, self-interested mentality. I do think it is something that we're going to see that isn't just limited to immigrants or refugees, but even Americans who are going to be displaced. So Pastor Tommy, do you mind if I ask you to answer first?
Sure. A conservative federal study puts the cost of moving Shishmaref at around $179 million. So that's a little bit beyond what like a GoFundMe page could raise. It's government level spending that needs to happen. So the way that we can move Shishmaref is only through with the help of the government and through support of others like you. So call your senators, tell them that you are concerned, and let them know that these are our people. I mean, they have all of the helpful labels. So they're Native American, so that goes great for getting help from the American government. Their main cause of suffering is climate change, and that's not really high on the docket of, and it's actually actively denied by the leadership currently. And then they're going to be refugees. So that's another thing that's not really helpful with the current political climate. So they have lots of stuff working against them. So the best way you can help Shishmaref is by talking about those 3 ways of being and make relationships with people who are refugees, who are suffering because of climate, and who are Native American, and living into and encountering those narratives, because they are part of us, and more part of us than we would like them to be.
I might build on that just a little bit by bringing up the idea of climate reparations, climate reparations as active neighbor love. because it seems to me that in international conversations, there are two important forms of climate reparations. And one is that the high emitting countries like ours vastly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which means rapid divestment from the fossil fuel industry and reinvestment. It means things like the Green New Deal, and it means really working through public policy. And the second form of climate reparations is enabling the adaptation of people who are currently displaced and suffering. And that would include people like the people of Shishmaref. And that, again, as Pastor Tommy just said, really does come to public policy work. And so I have begun to try to imagine ways that a lot of times Christians don't want to do public policy work. They want to do humanitarian interpersonal work. So I've been trying to challenge people to think about public policy engagement as deeply, deeply personal and as deeply impacting the lives of vulnerable people, and is very much a part of neighbor love. So public policy work to decrease our emissions, public policy, and by public policy, I include in that the whole work of divestment from the fossil fuel industry and into renewable energies. So seeing this as part of our intimate personal calling, and doing this engaged with others in communities so that it does become nourishing and fulfilling in terms of our interpersonal needs for community.
Great. And then the last two questions I want to ask. One is from Rachel. How can we disseminate this message and influence those religious individuals who do not see this faith-based call to climate action? And from Bill, with millions of people displaced, what is the answer on a high level beyond the small number who have been resettled in the US and other wealthy nations in terms of responding to this problem?
Krish, could you just repeat the first half of your question?
Sure. So the question from Rachel was, how can we disseminate this message to those individuals who do not see this, the faith-based call to climate action? And the second question is just, with so few people who have been displaced, who are actually going to be resettled in the US or other wealthy nations, what is the real kind of solution given the scale of this problem?
Well, let me talk to scale since I have before. Let's remind ourselves that, as I said at the beginning, that there are two parts to the answer to this. One is dealing with people who are displaced, and the other is making sure that we do not displace more people than we have to. Nobody wants to leave where they live. We all love the places that we were born into, and it is cruel, even if we manage to resettle people, to make them leave behind where they were. So the job of making sure that we limit the rise in temperature is key. And to the question of how to disseminate it, let me just add that one way to do that is to help people understand that it's a fight, and lots and lots and lots of good people, many of them wearing collars, have gone to jail or figured out how to join in big movements over the last few years. If you really want some leadership about who's getting the work done, look around at high school students in your neighborhood, because there's likely to be someone who's picked up on Greta Thunberg's message and is doing good and powerful work at forcing change. Look at young people like the Sunrise Movement who are bringing us the Green New Deal. Figure out how to get behind them, pushing for dramatic enough change. They're less limited by the idea that things are always going to be the way things have always been. And that's a useful property to have.
I guess I would just say in a few words in terms of how to bring this message to people of faith who don't see it as a matter of faith. I think what I would say is just a reminder that the principal moral and spiritual call of Jesus is to love your neighbor as yourself, and then to say what is happening to neighbors, and then to show some of the stories of what is happening to neighbors. So framing it that way as following Jesus seems to me one inroad.
Yeah, if I knew how to unstop the ears of somebody who doesn't want to listen, I'd be making a lot more money than I am right now. What we can do, if the sower goes out to sow, just keep sowing good seeds. Wherever you get the chance, wherever you get the opportunity, tell the story, make the connection. And it doesn't matter if it lands on fertile soil, just continue to go out and sow the seed. God is in charge of the growing. We cannot make, what is it? We can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink, right?
Exactly right. And I think that is the challenge that we face. So I really just want to say I'm so grateful for the panelists taking the time, sharing their insights with us. I know Robert asked a question about, are there reports or studies that a lay person, non-scientists could read to understand the ties between, increasing hurricanes and other natural disasters and its linked to climate change or the climate crisis. So I will note that we will be sending out a follow-up email. This event has been recorded, and we will send out that recording as well as a link to a few resources from our panelists. Please do share that far and wide. And really thank you again for your partnership in mobilizing action around this critical issue that is at the intersection of the climate crisis and immigration. Once again, thank you to the panelists for taking the time this afternoon. Thanks to the audience for tuning in.
And Krish, thank you to you for very good moderation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Such a
I also want to just thank LIRS for taking this on and for structuring this as you have, and you have been a brilliant moderator. And then I also, there's one resource I failed to mention at the seminary, Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary. We are launching a certificate in climate justice and faith that will be open to non-degree people, and we're doing it together with the Lutheran World Federation and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and Lutherans Restoring Creation. So for those who are interested in a certificate in climate justice and faith, they should take a look at that possibility. Yeah.
Great. Well, Cynthia, thank you for highlighting that. So we'll include that in the follow-up email that we will send. I really do hope that this is the beginning of many conversations, because obviously this issue, as our panelists have eloquently explained, it is sadly not going away, but in fact will get worse. But I still am so inspired by the comments, because I do think each of the panelists has explained that we should not give up hope. We should not sit on the sidelines, but really play each of us, our individual roles. So look forward to the next conversation. Everyone out there, please stay safe, stay healthy, and look forward to the next discussion. Thanks again, and have a great afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Take care, y'all.